Good morning, and welcome to the Center for New American Security's virtual conversation on driving innovation in the intelligence community. I'm Carrie Cordero. Before I introduce our moderator for this morning's conversation, I want to offer a few words about the report that lays the foundation for this discussion. Last month, the House Permanent Select Committee on Intelligence Subcommittee on Strategic Technologies and Advanced Research, which is known as the STAR Subcommittee, released a report entitled Rightly Scaled, Carefully Open, Infinitely Agile, Reconfiguring to Win the Innovation Race in the Intelligence Community. The STAR report warns of two trends that are risking America's national security. First, that the United States is in the midst of a Manhattan Project-like race to lead in the development of new technologies. And second, that the United States is risking losing what has been its post-Cold War leadership in these innovations. With respect to quantum computing, AI, and biotechnology, the report warns, and I quote, "Failing to lead the world in any one of these technologies might reset the international order, threaten the norms that have guided international conflict and competition, and undermine the model of international cooperation and leadership that has existed since the end of World War II. This report goes on to provide recommendations in the areas of government funding, hiring, building partnerships between government and the private sector, leveraging strengths, refreshing structures within the intelligence community, and developing standards and norms. Your moderator today for this critical conversation is my colleague, Martijn Rasser, a senior fellow here at CNAS in the Technology and National Security Program, who has extensive experience in the technology sector. Martijn is a former senior intelligence officer and analyst at the CIA, where he worked on foreign emerging technologies, innovation, and weapons research and development. He also served as a senior advisor in the Office of the Secretary of Defense, special advisor to a senior military commander in the Middle East, chief counterterrorism liaison to a U.S. military unit in Iraq, and vice chairman of a National Intelligence Council working group. His research focuses on the policy issues involved in emerging technologies such as AI and 5G. Thank you so much for joining us for this critical conversation, and over to Martijn Rasser to introduce our panelists and get this conversation started. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Carrie. Thank you for that kind introduction. I'm really looking forward to the discussion this morning. We have a stellar panel. Before I introduce them, however, I want to remind our audience that you can be a part of the conversation. I'll kick things off with a few questions, but we want to hear from you. You can submit questions in two ways. You can tweet it with the hashtag CNAS2020, that's hashtag CNAS2020, or you can submit a question at cnas.org/live. So let me introduce our guest. Congressman Himes represents Connecticut's 4th District. He's chairman of the STAR Subcommittee of the House Permanent Select Committee on Intelligence. Before running for office, the congressman was a Rhodes Scholar, VP at Goldman Sachs, and was very active in local politics, particularly on housing issues. Corin is a scholar in residence at American University's Washington College of Law. She's on leave from the Office of the Director of National Intelligence, where her most recent position was Deputy Director for Strategy and Engagement. Corin also served as Executive Director of the National Security Agency and as Associate General Counsel to the Coalition Provisional Authority in Iraq. Mike Brown is the Director of the Defense Innovation Unit at the Department of Defense. He's the co-author of a Pentagon study on China's participation in the U.S. venture ecosystem, a catalyst for the Foreign Investment Risk Review Modernization Act, more commonly known as FIRMA. Mike is the former CEO of the cybersecurity firm Symantec Corporation and the former CEO and chairman of Quantum Corporation, a leader in the computer storage industry. Welcome, everyone. So, Congressman, let me start by congratulating you on this report. It's comprehensive, insightful, and it's also a very engaging read. So I highly encourage everyone in our audience who hasn't read it already to give it a look, because it's very worthwhile. Most importantly, though, it offers concrete actionable recommendations. So let's start with a broad framing question. Carrie already touched on this in her opening remarks, but Congressman, why was this report necessary, and what risks do we run if we don't heed its recommendations?
Yeah, Martin, thank you. Thank you to you and Carrie and to the Center for a New American Security. I'm just delighted to be on this panel with people who live this every day. You know, as a congressional overseer, we sort of drop in and in the production of this report, of course, we spend a lot of time with the elements of the intelligence community and of the Department of Defense, but we don't live it every day. So I'm really very much looking forward to this conversation and reflections back, positive or negative, on the report, because the topic is really is essential. You know, we have taken for granted, because it's been true since the mid 1940s, that this country has been at the cutting edge of pretty much every technological innovation out there, and that has had, of course, dramatic positive implications for our national security, but also dramatic positive implications for prosperity. You know, you look at the big tech companies, you know, they grew out of American innovation. Fascinatingly, and beyond the scope of this conversation, they grew out of American innovation, often led by recent immigrants, but that's beyond the scope of our conversation. I think the reason this report was important, I would highlight a couple of reasons that we really tried to tease out in this report. Number one, in government, you know, the important is always crowded out by the urgent. There's always something, and it can be really quite urgent, like COVID today. You know, COVID has consumed the Congress now for well over half a year. Doesn't mean necessarily we've been terribly effective at doing anything about it for the last couple of months, but it's consumed the attention. And, you know, an eroding position in innovation is something that you don't notice until there's something fairly spectacular. And of course, we cite the inevitable Sputnik example, where all of a sudden it's just very evident that our antagonists abroad have beaten us to something. So there's that issue. Then there were maybe two or three other things that we sought to do. Number one, in this office, and I've been doing this for 12 years or so, the answer to everything is always spend more money. And okay, it is probably true that we should invest more in basic R&D, but it is also true that the world, and the private sector in particular, is investing far more in R&D than they did 2 generations ago. And so the challenge is, as much or maybe more, how do we leverage, understand, partner in that research and that innovation than it is, let's do it all by ourselves, the way, you know, Vannevar Bush did it in 1945. Third, I would highlight, if you think about it, the attributes of innovation, talk to anybody, you know, on the Route 128 corridor, Palo Alto or Austin, Texas, or wherever, New York City, are in many ways sort of culturally antithetical to what is government. Government is hierarchical. Government is precedent-based and respectful of precedent. It's rank-oriented. All of those things in some way erode it's risk-averse, of course, erode your ability to innovate. And we grapple with that in the report. And then finally, I feel obligated to highlight this, because even in your framing, you fell into something that we always fall into, which is, yes, we want to be at the cutting edge of innovation. We want to win the race, or at worst be a fast follower. But we have to be very cognizant of the fact that technological races, as we say in the report, never stay won. Technology and innovation disperse. It's a law of physics. And so, you know, we need to grapple with the fact that we won't always be the first to the punch on quantum computing or something related to biosynthesis. And therefore, we really need to lead to establish those norms and protocols that create at least understanding about how this technology will be used. And of course, there's any number of analogs around the Geneva Convention and the hundreds of years of you know, development of norms. And that's really important, again, because as much as we want to win the race of technological innovation, those races never stay won.
Yeah, that's a great point, Congressman. You know, Mike, I'd like to turn to you on that concept of a technology race, and more broadly, the need for long-term sustained investment in innovation. This is something you've written a lot about. This is something that you see every day in your position at DIU. What were your reactions as you were going through the report, particularly that concept of the need for broad-based technological competitiveness? Oh, you're still on the mute, Mike.
Thanks for having me, and thanks for putting this on. I want to congratulate Congressman Himes for what I thought was a stellar report. I think what struck me in reading it was how much of it applied to the Defense Department, in addition to the intelligence community that that it was written for. Yeah, and I think the Congressman just touched on some of the key points. We need to recognize that this is a long-term race, multi-generational. I've called it a superpower marathon. And that requires both the investment in that the federal government can make in basic research, and that's been on a decline basically since the mid-1960s in this country as a percentage of GDP. So I'd love to see us start to get that back so that we can make those investments that are the seed corn for future economic prosperity. As Congressman Himes said, the spillover effects you get from that basic research have created the prosperity that we're living today. The companies that are in Silicon Valley and Route 128 are building on a foundation of government research that often we don't recognize in those communities, that it all is built on the shoulders of others that came before us in terms of those innovations, GPS, internet, miniaturized electronics, and so forth. And then as Congressman Himes pointed out correctly, the trend towards more research dollars in the private sector is a reality we have to face. So while the Defense Department may have led that early days of Silicon Valley when the semiconductor industry was formed, we need to create the right. That's not the case today. We need to be a fast follower. There's more investment that's happening in the private sector. So we need to learn to be a fast follower. And I think that's what a lot of the recommendations of the report are aimed at, so that the IC and the Defense Department can take advantage of the best of American innovation that's happening in the private sector.
Yeah, absolutely. It very much struck me as a set of very sensible, realistic recommendations, particularly as the United States collectively has to start thinking more strategically about long-term technological competitiveness. I think this provides a great foundation to elevate that discussion in a more fruitful direction. Corin, I want to turn to you now. I want to dig into some of the details of the report. Now, I know that when you were at NSA, that agency created a chief risk officer and a new risk management framework. What's your take on the risk issues that the report raised?
Thanks, Martin, and thanks for having me on. I'm glad to be here, and I really appreciate the report from Congressman Himes and the STAR Committee. I think it's a terrific report, and it's completely consistent with my experience over the last couple of years in trying to tackle these issues for the intelligence community. So I appreciate that there are concrete recommendations in it, and that we can actually work together with a like-minded committee to try and solve some of these issues once and for all. I think on the risk point, I was struck by the fact that the report actually addressed it, because so often we don't talk about this issue, and it's a really big issue. And as you say, when I was at the NSA, we created a new position called the Chief Risk Officer, and a risk assessment framework that the director actually approved, and really helps the workforce think through decisions that they can make, risks that they're taking, what the consequences may be, the unintended consequences. And I think if we want a workforce that is innovative, creative, cutting edge, we have to give them a framework to understand what kinds of risks they can and cannot take, especially in this area of emerging technology where, we know that there are going to be failures. For every 100 failures, you probably get one innovative idea that works. And so we have to be tolerant. We have to have an understanding of our risk tolerance. And I think it's critical that not only within the executive branch, but with Congress, there be some level of agreement, whether it's formal or informal, that enables our people to feel confident that when they're taking these steps, if something doesn't go exactly as planned, that they'll survive that it won't be the end of their career, and that we can move on from that. And that means having a good understanding about who's making what decisions, what the risks are entailed, and what level of loss we're willing to sustain. And so I think we need to create some sort of risk framework that the executive branch can agree to, as far as kind of where those levels of decisions are made, what the likelihood and severity of certain risks are, and that Congress can then say, we're on the same page. We think this is a good approach. That's not to say that, we're always going to have smiles when something goes awry, but at least we know people will be able to continue on with their jobs. They won't have any personal liability or professional liability in those ways that can really push people to not take risks, when that's exactly the opposite of what we need when it comes to innovation.
Great, thank you, Corin. And that's actually a fantastic segue. We're already getting a lot of questions from our viewers right now, and one that I want to put forward to the whole panel. So one of the questions is, the report describes the cost of failure in this area. How can policymakers paint a clearer picture for the American people? And I'll open that up to whoever wants to take a crack at that first.
Well, I'll start. I think the opening comments that Carrie made really begin to characterize the cost of failure. We're in a long-term race, and we have not lived in a world where the United States is not the largest economy. We could be facing that within the next decade. And purchasing power parity terms, China is already larger than the US, obviously has a much larger population. And they make a phenomenal investment in technology. Their government realizes, with some long-term investment and planning, that technology is the key to economic prosperity as well as national security. We've been in the lead so long, as Congressman Himes pointed out, we don't know what it's like to live in an environment where these key game-changing technologies, let's use 5G as an example, are defined by another country's companies. So while we were sleeping, China was on the scene making 5G a reality. The investment they've made to make Huawei a global leader, we're not happy with that outcome, and we're just seeing the tip of the iceberg in terms of other technologies that will come along. AI, biotechnology, quantum sciences, what's happening in space. We don't want to be in that position. It will threaten our economic prosperity, because China's industrial policy, their well-laid plans, Made in China 2025, China Standards 2035, are all about displacing the US as the technology leader. And if that happens, that threatens our national security. We cannot project the national power we would like if we are a shrinking economy and we don't have the technology to equip our military.
I would just add, from the intelligence community perspective, that I think we are always worried about and thinking about our intelligence adversaries and what those intelligence adversary services are doing in this space. And so if we as a community don't have the tools we need and can't attract the people that we need to attract, then we're going to have a harder time providing the insights that the policymakers need, because our adversaries are going to be using these tools against us as a community, and we need to be able to both defend and use them in our own right.
Excellent, thank you. We are having a ton of questions come in, which is absolutely fantastic. Here's another really interesting one. Again, anyone on the panel can take a crack at this one. What lessons can we learn from earlier U.S. efforts to invest in other forms of technological innovation? The report laid out the lessons learned from Vannevar Bush and the Cold War era. So Congressman, maybe you could start. How do you think about these historical lessons and how they apply to the situation that the United States is in today? Oh, you're on mute, sir.
Sorry about that. It's a super interesting question, because on the one hand, there are some big lessons that can be learned. On the other hand, and maybe I'll sort of slant my comments in this direction. Innovation is a very, very different animal in the 21st century than it was in 1945. We do look back to the Manhattan Project and Vannevar Bush because it's good for metaphors. What if the Nazis had beaten us to a nuclear weapon? That's the kind of thing that focuses attention. But the reality was, in 1945, we were the economic colossus. Europe and Asia, Japan were in ruins. We were the economic colossus. There was no even near competitor. And we had the innovative minds, for good reasons bad. We had all of the innovative minds working on the Manhattan Project and on other things, and so there are some lessons to be drawn from that era, which is that intentional investment in carefully thought out technologies is smart. It is the government experts who really are going to have the capital and the understanding of our national security challenges to figure out, how do we need to think about biosynthesis versus quantum computing, all of these issues that we talk about. But you can't overthink the way the world used to be, because it's not that way anymore. In other words, the innovation that is being done, certainly in areas like AI, maybe less in quantum computing. And the difference there, of course, is one of dispersion and capital concentration and that sort of thing. But innovation today is happening as much at Google and Facebook and in China and elsewhere than it is inside government-directed labs. And so the challenge is very different, and again, the report really tries to get at this, which is that sure, we can spend more money, and we probably should, but what we really need to do is to figure out how we inside the government in classified spaces get access to the kind of thinking and the kind of minds that exist at Google and Facebook and the 5G producers and the innovators out there. How do we create a flow back and forth of talent and brains? Look, the Chinese are doing that pretty well, right? They are offering all sorts of incentives for the very best minds in certain technologies to go to China to teach, to do whatever, to be part of the innovative machine. But so to me, what's new about the 21st century is the requirement that we do counterintuitive things, right? National security professionals think in terms of classification, need to know, though we've made great progress in the last 20 years, there is still to some extent a stovepipe mentality for all the right reasons in terms of keeping classified information safe. But that's inimical to the kind of interchange that we need to create. Therefore, this report suggests things like, how do we do more cross-pollination with academia, with innovators? Could we create programs that bring people for short periods of time into the innovative units of the IC? So anyway, that's a long-winded way of saying that while I think there are some lessons that you can draw from the past, we need to remember that we're in a very, very different global ecosystem right now, and we need to address that ecosystem. And by the way, some of our strengths, last point, are going to be good in that regard. If you think about how innovation happens, it doesn't happen really along the Chinese model of, billions of dollars laser focused on certain things in a very hierarchical and structured way. Innovation happens by, misfits in coffee shops talking to each other about great ideas and that sort of thing. And that's actually what we're good at as Americans, right? Accepting the possibility of failure, accepting risk in a way that I don't think culturally is going to be easy for the Chinese to embrace.
Yeah, those are fascinating points. Corin, I'd love to get your response to that, because particularly within the IC, the issue of stovepipes has always been an issue. It's gotten a lot better over the years. But then, of course, in terms of talent exchanges, how do you bring people into the IC more easily and more quickly? From your vantage point, from your days at ODNI, can you tell us a little bit about how the ODNI is thinking about these issues and what some opportunities and barriers are to doing the types of things that the Congressman is describing?
Sure, and I should say that I'm speaking on behalf of myself. I'm not speaking on behalf of the ODNI or the IC, but there are so many people working on this point in particular, and I'm glad we're talking about people, because people are the IC's most important asset. And if we can't get the right people in, retain them, and tap into critical skills in the private sector and around the world, then we're going to have a real problem from the perspective of the intelligence community. I think there is a lot of opportunity in this space. First and most strategic, I would say, is that there is huge leadership support and buy-in right now on all of these issues. Over the last 2 to 3 years, we've had key strategic initiatives that are joint initiatives across the entire IC, where all of the IC agency directors and deputies came together and said, these are the most important things we can work on together. And one of those was people. We called it the Right Trusted Agile Workforce Initiative. And there was broad recognition, number one, that the workforce does not want to sit in one place for their entire career for 30 years. So we're having a workforce that wants to move around more easily, and we need to allow for that. And number two, that national security is not best served by having people who sit in one place for 30 years. If we don't understand the private sector and the private sector doesn't understand the government, it's a problem. National security is a team sport in a way that it hasn't been in the past, given both the digital interconnectedness that we have around the country and around the world, and that our critical infrastructure is really controlled in the private sector. So we cannot protect national security alone from within the government. And our senior leadership really understands that we must make opportunities for people to go in and out so that we learn from the private sector, they understand the government, and we're continually refreshing our skills. So that's one huge opportunity. Second, I think thanks to Congress, we have new legislation called the Public-Private Talent Exchange that we're in the process of implementing. This is legislation that allows, again, for people to do 3 to 4 year stints, either in government or private sector, whichever they're not in right at the moment, to get that expertise and bring it back to their home organizations and really to broaden the skills that we have. And DOD has had that legislation for about 3 years. And so we're learning from what DOD has done and putting the policies in place to implement that as quickly as possible. Third, I think as the report notes, we can better take advantage of some of the tools we already have, like highly qualified experts and special government employees. Those are constructs that allow for us to bring people in on sort of temporary appointments who are in really critical skill fields that we may not otherwise be able to tap into. And so we need to further the use of those. And I liked the idea in the report of the IC STEM's fellowship program as well. There are two areas that I would call opportunities and hurdles, frankly. The first is that we have been forced to rethink our approach to how we work due to COVID. And so there is an increased recognition that we can allow some employees to telework and we can have some uncleared employees. And the argument that it's just not possible in the intelligence community has really started to fall by the wayside. Although to be sure, there are some roles that cannot be done that way, but there are many roles that can be done that way. And we've had to learn very quickly which roles those are and how we can adapt the mindset to allow for that. And we need the IC, and we have the opportunity for the IC to really embrace and run with some of the interesting solutions that the agencies have come up with to allow for more employees to work in an unclassified manner. And that will lead, I think, to an unclassified segment of the workforce that, as the report notes, would be pretty useful. That said, we really haven't resolved all the issues associated with this kind of a workforce. In many instances, just to get in the intelligence community buildings, you need a clearance. Certainly to get on any of the systems, you need a clearance. And so in order to make sure we have appropriate connectivity, we have to work through some of these issues. I think another related concern that stems from trying this many, many years ago is that you start to create a workforce that feels like or is treated as a second-class citizen because they don't have access to all of the information and the systems and the like. And what we want to make sure is that we don't have that kind of dynamic emerge. And so I think that that is something we need to still work through. And we're doing so now in pilots, which is the good news. So we do have some pilots. We started them before I left in IARPA with some of those special constructs. And so we're working to see what that might look like, how we can get people in, where they can work, and how we can address some of those issues. The second area that I think is both an opportunity and a hurdle is security clearance reform. The opportunity is that we have such a huge government-wide push to actually make it quicker to get the clearances through. And I don't think there's a single senior leader who doesn't agree this is critical. The hurdle is that it is still a very difficult task and is very slow to change. And, you know, when you talk to people, the security people will tell you it's an HR problem. The HR people will tell you it's a security problem. And the fact is they're both right. There are issues on both sides. Most organizations don't really understand their onboarding processes that well. And when you look at them in depth, you see that there's delays scattered throughout the processes. Some of it is part of the design. Some of it is because we have humans in the loop. In both areas, there's great policy being pushed out, but implementation is slow, if at all, and the consistency across the intelligence community, let alone across the entire government, is just really something huge to try to tackle. We are trying to tackle that through the Right Trusted Agile Workforce Initiative, but it's still a complex process. And within the IC, the Director of National Intelligence doesn't have personnel authority that is directive over the entire IC. Each IC agency has another boss, whether it's a department secretary or an agency head, who basically controls the personnel authority for that organization. And so not having the ability to kind of mandate personnel policies in this space can be a hindrance, although I'm not a fan of mandating things, but that can be a hindrance. There's also, of course, cultural impediments and technology issues. But I think there are hurdles that can be overcome. Real quickly, last couple points. I think there's a lot of process in the government. Someone already mentioned that. I'm a fan of process. I'm a lawyer, and there are really good reasons to have processes, but I am not a fan of too much process, which can stifle and slow everything down. And in many cases, we do have too much process. And then also just the tech talent that is so hard to come by generally and often is foreign born. And I think that's going to be a continued hurdle for the IC.
Great. Thank you, Corin. That was super comprehensive. Mike, did you have some thoughts that you wanted to add to the question?
Yeah, I'd love to weigh in. I certainly agree with everything Corin said. We really need to make it much easier to have an exchange of folks from the tech community into the government, and right now that's tough to do. But the way we can take advantage of that tech talent where they are in the companies where they're working goes back to what Congressman Himes talked about. A lot of the innovation is happening in the private sector today versus maybe if we go back to the 1940s model. But we can take advantage of that as long as we create the demand for that innovation that government places on those private companies. So this is one of the ideas behind the Defense Innovation Unit. How can we look to the private sector where that innovation is created, and how can we quickly adopt that within the government? So the government can play a tremendous role in terms of that demand signal. Where do we need innovation, and then paying for it? DIU influences about $1.5 billion worth of DoD procurement. That's actually not a very big number. In that same time that we've influenced that over a 3-year period, the government's probably bought $500 billion worth of gear. That needs to be a much bigger signal, demand signal, to these innovative companies that there's a big market here. And to the extent we are able to share that beyond, say, the defense primes, which have most of the Defense Department's dollars, we create that signal and start that cycle of having more of those innovative companies look to the Defense Department as a potential customer. That's a big win for what we need to do to modernize both the IC and DoD.
You know, Martin, if I could jump in really quickly,
please do.
I want to emphasize something that's kind of prosaic. It's not, whiz bang, gee whiz stuff or reorienting acquisition models, but one thing I wish we'd had more time to do, and that I promise you the Congress is going to focus on, and as much as I have anything to say about it, is this question of security clearance reform. And I'm going to be very brief on this because I'm at best a sophomore on it. But the more I dove into it, the more I realized, my God, we've got a dysfunctional system. And by the way, that's acknowledged in the in the various agencies, because we have had for some period of time now an effort to reform it. But I mean, when I first heard that on average, and this is not true anymore, but it was true quite recently, that on average, depending on the nature of the clearance you were going after, it could take 2 years to get a security clearance. And by the way, some of the very sensitive stuff and difficult cases, which is probably in some cases those most essential to our national security, it can take 5 years. That's not a broken system. That's an absurd system. There's no human on the planet. Well, there actually are a few humans on the planet, but nobody should be asked to wait for 3 years to get paid a lot less than you can get paid in the private sector to help keep your country safe. And again, I don't want to overstate my understanding of this because, and the fact that I don't have a good understanding of it is actually indicative of one of the congressional problems. But think about the absurdity of two things that we know to be true. We know that it is true that it takes years to get a security clearance on the one hand. On the other hand, we know it's true and we worry about the extent that apparently Google and Facebook and the ISPs know literally everything about us. So on the one hand, we're saying we're all concerned about the fact that, and of course, recruiting operational people is very, very hard because, in fact, the data is out there. The digital dust is out there. You can learn everything about a person. And this, of course, raises all sorts of privacy issues and other constitutional issues around the treatment of U.S. persons, et cetera, et cetera. But think of the absurdity of that. On the one hand, there is a data set out there that is hugely accurate about what a human has done in the last 15 years. And on the other hand, we're still sending people around, to interview your college roommates to say what they remember from 20 years ago. I mean, it's just, again, it's not broken, it's absurd.
Yeah, no, I've lived through that process, so I'm very sympathetic to this. So we've been getting a lot of questions about Congress, and so I'll stitch a few of these together. So there was one comment. So innovation outpaces legislation, and so how should Congress position itself to come up with effective legislation on these issues? There was a tangential question. This person wanted to know, what is Congress doing to scan and search for small but promising ideas? So I think that's getting at, potential areas of future innovation, which I don't know how much Congress itself would play a role in that, but how would you enable other elements of the U.S. government to do that more effectively? And then finally, a question on just the prospect of the recommendations in the report. How do you see that playing out with, at least a couple years of divided government ahead of us? Can you talk a little bit about the level of bipartisan support for the types of recommendations in the report?
Yeah. Let me start big picture, and I'll try to be concise in this because honestly, living it day to day, the Congress is a huge problem with respect to innovation. And let me start with the good news. The good news is twofold. Number one, the Congress is going to be subject to demographic change over time, right? So anybody who was treated to the prospect, the vision of certain United States senators of a certain age, talking to social media platform executives knows that there is still in the Congress, because we are by and large an older group of people, a very substantial population of people who just didn't grow up in the digital world. And that, of course, over time begins to change as the Congress becomes younger. People who grew up surrounded by technology, who understand the power of innovation, the pervasiveness of our technology. That's one bit of good news. And by the way, I don't in any way mean that to be a criticism of the wisdom and capability of the older members of the two chambers here. Number two is that we have models that work. And people constantly bring up the Office of Technological Assessment, which that was before my time. But when it was here, apparently it was an unbelievable entity which permeated an awareness of technology in congressional offices. And that's really essential because, first of all, we're all lay people by and large. Yes, we have our particular expertises, but very few of us are innovators. There are some, but very, very few members of Congress or senators, or quite frankly, people on their staff are innovators. We are people who've been attracted to an institution, which in some ways is in the opposite of the kind of disruptive atmosphere that innovators face. But the problem is more dire than it appears on the surface, because Congress, apart from being what I just described, is I realize this my second year here. You can think about it as a place where a left-right fight occurs. And yeah, that's one model that actually, describes how Congress operates. There's an aisle and there's people on either side of the aisle. An equally valid way of understanding the Congress is that it is an institution completely dedicated to preserving legacy institutions and technologies. That's what we do. If you're on the left in the Democratic Party, you are committed and you will lose your seat for the preservation of social insurance programs that were created in the 1930s and the 1960s, and you're not going to touch those things. If you're on the right, if you're a Republican, and I'm drawing a little bit of a cartoon here, you are fully dedicated to the preservation of legacy industries, agriculture, carbon-based energy extraction. So this is a huge institution dedicated to quashing the disruption that, of course, upsets the many organizations and constituencies around here that have a real vested interest in the status quo. So it is a fascinating question how the future gets a vote in this institution. I'll tell you, 2 years ago, that occurred to me when I stepped off the floor and came down the steps, and I stood there between these Corinthian columns, and I realized, oh my God, I could be in ancient Rome 2,000 years ago. I'm just missing the toga here. This is not a forward-looking institution. So, okay, so what do we do about it? I do think the OTA provides a really good model. I do think the demographic change is going to be helpful in that regard. But candidly, it's only been in my relatively short career here that the innovators in the private sector, and name them, whether it's biotechnology or Facebook or Google or what have you, have actually had a presence in Washington, D.C. And that was often generated by actually concerns around immigration policy. And so one of the things, I sort of hate to talk in favor of lobbyists, but nonetheless, one of the things that's going to make Congress a more forward-looking institution is when people, innovators, companies that are in the business of innovation actually establish themselves in DC, build the relationships, and start advocating for a greater willingness to accept the disruption of legacy industries and legacy ways of thinking, and create momentum inside the institution around the innovation.
Oh, great. Thank you, Congressman. I'd like to change tack here a little bit. So there's an element of the report that talks about better engaging with foreign partners, and we're getting numerous questions along these lines as well. So Congressman Corin, I'd be interested in your thoughts on how you envision the intelligence community better leveraging foreign partnerships in order to encourage technological innovation. And then, Mike, I'd love to get your perspective just from a broader American competitiveness standpoint, where you see the need for better collaboration with like-minded countries. So, Corin, let's start with you, and then we'll go to the Congressman and then to Mike.
Great. Well, I think, I agree wholeheartedly that, in the global environment of today, there's no way around this. I mean, we really have to partner with our allies and like-minded nations, both because obviously there is limited STEM talent across the nation and around the world, and we need to leverage that talent where it lives. And because the diversity of views and approaches is good for mission, and really important for us to understand kind of how folks are operating around the world. And because, frankly, we can split the work up a little bit. There's no reason for all of us to tackle the same issues if we can actually kind of divide and conquer and get to some solution spaces more quickly. So there are a lot of good reasons for doing this. And I think the intelligence community recognizes that. I think the report talks about the Five Eyes relationship, and that's, of course, one. But there are many great relationships that the intelligence community has around the world. And I think there are some very deep ones, although not all of them, of course. Some of the hurdles that I think we come up against, and I'm not sure how we resolve this yet, but one is, of course, security. So how deeply do we want even our allies to know the issues that we're facing that require a solution? How much do we want to kind of give up in the space that says we really haven't been able to solve this problem and we want to work it together? That's one concern. I think another concern that's out there is that if we become reliant on any one partner, we risk letting our expertise atrophy in that space and potentially create a dependency on a partner that perhaps sometime down the road may not be there. It is possible that something will happen that will change the nature of our relationship with whatever partner, and we won't be able to rely on their capability, their insights, and we may not then have the backup we need to get it ourselves. And so there's always this feeling of, not creating a single point of failure, and how do we make sure we have enough duplication and redundancy that we can survive if the partnership doesn't, but also that we're not just duplicating what's going on out there. But I think there's no doubt that we need these deep relationships. I think the good news is that we've seen both in DARPA and IARPA that so much of what we need in this space doesn't have to be classified, and it doesn't have to be done in secret. And so I think, the science and technology itself often isn't necessarily the secretive part. It's how you apply it to the mission space. And so I think we need to think a little bit more about that as well in deepening these relationships.
Yeah, thank you, Corin. Congressman, yeah, please, I'd love to hear your thoughts on this very important issue.
Well, and we should hear from Mike too, but I think all I've got to, I agree with everything that Corin said. Our allies have particular areas of expertise that we should be deeply cognizant of and embedded in understanding. And you know what they are. And it's not just the Five Eyes partners, right? The Israelis are second to none in terms of communication technology and that sort of thing. And even though we don't have a Five Eyes relationship, we want to be there, not just in their national security apparatus, but understanding the remarkable companies that are getting started. I guess the counterintuitive point I'd like to make, though, is that it's not just our allies and our friends. The reality is we have a profound interest in understanding what advances are being made inside China. And that's not as crazy as it sounds, because, of course, academia has a long tradition of conferences, of papers, of peer review. And I would much rather, because I do believe that openness favors democracies, I would much rather promulgate and encourage an open environment that includes our adversaries, rather than create a world where more and more innovation is happening behind closed doors. And so I would just put that on the table as important. And again, I think that's good for the advancement of knowledge. I also think it's good for open democracies, for the playing field to be more open.
Great, thank you. Mike, please go ahead.
Yeah, the tech race, we need to use all the tools that we can. As has already been said, it's never won. And the asymmetric advantage we have in the United States is allies. That's very different than China. So this is a key strength. It's a pillar in the national defense strategy to strengthen our relationship with partners and allies. And they have a lot to teach us in the technology spaces. As Congressman Himes said, we don't really have a corner on global innovation. Martin, you've written a lot about this. So there's a tremendous opportunity for us to really embrace allies, both in creating standards, in sharing the burden, as Corin talked about. We don't have to do everything ourselves. Some of our allies have some key strengths. And to really create a trading bloc of, if you want to think about that, both in goods, but also ideas. We want there to be free flow of capital, ideas, and talent across our allies as we promote and develop these technologies, the game-changing technology of the future. So I think it needs to be a key pillar of how the U.S. goes forward to play and win in this race.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I wholeheartedly agree with all of your comments, and I think it's very encouraging to see that our allies are increasingly saying very similar things. So overall, I'm pretty bullish on the next couple of years, where we'll see some real meaningful efforts to that type of closer collaboration that you all have been describing. Let me jump back into the report itself real quick. So, Congressman, in the section "Congress Heal Thyself," there's some sharp critiques of Congress. Could you walk us through some of the key points, and how have your colleagues reacted to this?
So we're the Article 1 authority, right? At the end of the day, sort of our will does prevail, and so I always feel like it's stupid for Congress to write reports that point the finger. We at the end of the day are responsible for the solutions as much as anyone else, and for the reasons I outlined before. We do have a lot of work to do in terms of really being, at a minimum, even cognizant of technology and innovation, of realizing that we're in an environment that doesn't encourage innovation, and we need to do something about that. There's other things I would stress, which is we need to create, and by the way, I really believe, and I say this with some humility because I'm not an expert as to what happens inside the Pentagon, but I've heard sort of the unanimous notion that this is true, that we need to create environments inside the Congress and inside places like the Pentagon where risk is thought about more rationally. And I'm deliberately not using the word embraced, because I think embraced is a little much. Some of this stuff is about life and death. If we're talking about, technologies that we use to communicate with sources in, denied environments, this is, failure is not an option. So I don't want to over exaggerate the importance of this, but Congress needs to understand that when you are railing at if you're a member of Congress on HASC, on the House Armed Services Committee, and you're railing at a flag officer because there was a failure in some unit that was trying something new, you're actually damaging our national security. And there's good failures and there's bad failures, right? And the private sector understands this. Failures of incompetence or inattention, et cetera, are deserving of condemnation. But when you try something new and that new thing fails, and now you've got 3 senators and 2 members of Congress breathing down your neck and threatening your budget, guess what? You're not going to try new things. At the risk of getting a little partisan or political, one of the more painful examples I can float for you is early on in my experience here, my friends on the Republican side decided to attack President Obama using Solyndra, right? So the Department of Energy, of course, has a very smart program which is designed to fund those innovative startups, really, that have ideas that are just wacky enough that they're not going to get funded by the venture capital community. Makes all the sense in the world. It's a little bit sort of the In-Q-Tel model, but makes all the sense in the world because there are good technologies that won't get funded. And Solyndra, for a variety of reasons, doesn't succeed. And it gets used as a cudgel for a year. And, you know, inside the Congress, we need to understand that if we are going to keep our competitive edge, there are going to be failures, and there need to be leaders inside the Congress as well as inside the Pentagon who say, you know, I'm glad you failed. It's not gonna damage your budget or screw up your promotion because you failed in the right way, right? You know, Silicon Valley says fail rapidly because every failure is a learning thing. And again, I want to be very clear: there are dumb failures, but failure is really an essential part of an innovative environment. And Congress is not on board with that, and it needs to be. I don't know quite how you fix that. I think actually staff can play a really important role in conditioning members. You know, again, it's, you know, one of the problems that we members and senators suffer is that we think about 40 things in a 6-hour period. So it's really hard to really sit back and sort of say, wait a minute, yes, failure is a critical part of innovation. But, you know, we come and go. Sometimes the staff is always here. And I think we could rely on them to say, well, sir, you know, well, ma'am, you know, understand that this innovation came because we screwed it up 3 times and then we had this remarkable success. So somehow institutionally, we need to become a less risk averse and more failure cognizant culture here.
Yeah, it's definitely a considerable challenge, of course, one that'll take some time, but yes, absolutely important that we get there eventually. But I think I'm quite optimistic on that because, you know, just engaging with congressional staffers, you know, there's a lot of very smart people that really know the tech sector well, and I think, you know, as that knowledge permeates throughout the halls of Congress, you know, we will definitely get there.
Martin, can I add another dimension
Yeah,
that I think the report highlights, but another dimension beyond what you talked about, Congressman Himes, is how the money is allocated. So in the section of the report, Get the Dollars Right, which really resonated with me, you talk about the rigidity in the appropriations process and the damage that continuing resolutions cause. So I think what we have to recognize is our system created through history and the budgeting process at the Pentagon from the Robert McNamara days is not consistent with the pace of innovation we see happening around us. So taking 2 years, for example, to spend $1 in the IC or the DoD is inconsistent with the pace. And we have to take some risk, as you say, in terms of the flexibility. We have to recognize that while we want to be completely transparent and should be, we might need some flexibility in terms of how those dollars are spent. You might not be able to plan 2 years in advance how every dollar is going to be spent and keep up with the technology that's changing at a much more rapid pace around us.
Amen. Amen. And I'm far from a acquisition expert, but you know, to innovative ears, you know, to the private sector, if you're using language like plan 2 years in advance, it's game over already, right? Because 2 years from now, in a truly innovative environment, we have no idea what is going on. So I couldn't agree more with that.
Exactly.
Excellent. Yeah, no, these are very important points. Corin, would you like to add your thoughts on this point as well?
The only thing I would add, I think in particular on the budget piece, you know, there are 2 things that I think are difficult that we need to sort of figure out. One is a pilot that actually DoD is running right now on one color of money for this emerging technology. They're doing it for software, but, you know, you don't necessarily want to have to use different pots of money for the R&D and then the acquisition and then the sustainment. If you can use one type of money, one budget line for all of that, that would be hugely helpful. I think the other is more than 1 year money, 2-year money, or even no year money that doesn't expire after every year, I think will be important for this, because oftentimes we see in these cases where you have money expiring at the end of the year, you just spend it so you don't lose it. And that doesn't mean that you're spending it in the best way possible. And that's really not what we want to encourage. And so I think maybe that means there's some kind of emerging technology fund that's particular to this space. I mean, there are a lot of different creative people out there who are smarter on the budget than I am, but I know that these areas do cause a lot of difficulty to just keep up with innovation and emerging technology. And I think, having a willing partner in Congress to talk through some of these ideas and kind of come up with a solution that might actually work and still allow the insights that Congress needs, I think is critical, because so much of these processes came about not because people wanted to make it hard, but because there were insights that were critical. Congress is our oversight, and that's really important. And so we do have to make sure that we're balancing and ensuring that oversight still remains good and effective and visible, but there has to be a new way to do it.
Yeah, excellent points. Excellent points. So we are coming up on the hour. I think we have time for one more question, and then Congressman, I'll give you the final word. Just a quick takeaway for our audience. There was a passage in the report discussing suspicion and tension between the private sector and the government, and how that's impeded trust and relationships required for a healthy innovation ecosystem. And we've gotten a few audience questions as well that touch on that point. Mike, maybe we can start with you. Just from your perspective out in Silicon Valley, how do you see this dynamic, and how is that impairing America's ability to innovate?
Well, there's no question. There's still some overhang from the Snowden incident, as well as the ongoing discussion on encryption. But I find that we have tremendous enthusiasm from innovative companies wanting to work with the government. Capitalism prevails here. As long as we can show that there's an opportunity to have access to government spending, I see it through defense contracts, we can get the attention of the innovative companies. That's why I think creating a strong demand signal is so important to be kind of the overriding perspective here. So the more we can make that easier, the more we can tap into what these innovative companies are doing, I think we get beyond that overhang.
Great. Thank you, Michael. Corin, do you have any thoughts on this point?
I'd just add that I think transparency is key here, and we've evolved over the last 10 years to figure out how you are both secretive as an intelligence community organization and then transparent, which you can do, but it's not a natural state for intelligence community officers. And so we continue to learn and figure out how to be more and more transparent about who we are, how we operate, our processes, our laws. There are certain things we cannot obviously disclose, but there's a lot that we can talk about. And the more we can do that and create a sense of understanding with the American people, I think the better off we'll be. We do have to distinguish, though, between policy disagreements, which are fine and appropriate, and people can disagree with the policy. That's part of our democracy. And, understanding that the government is using things in certain ways, and that we are, law-abiding citizens who are trying to protect national security.
Absolutely.
There's work for both the Congress and the IC to do, though. It's not hard to identify what creates the attention and the suspicion. It's variously concerns about privacy, concerns about the IC protecting the constitutional rights of Americans, concerns about lethal counterterrorism activity, that sort of thing. There's at least, you're never going to fix the problem, but one thing that is really important is that we need to do a much better job, we collectively, the Congress and the IC and the DOD, at really explaining the immense amount of work that the national security apparatus does to protect constitutional rights and to act decently, which of course is a different category of things. I mean, I can't tell you how often, and I've been on the Intelligence Committee for 4 Congresses now, how often relatively smart people, come up to me and say, the NSA is listening in on my phone calls. And I say, oh my God, we don't have a... no, they're not. And so we need to do a much better job, I think, of making sure that Americans really understand the protections that are there and the amount of effort and time and money and personnel that go into making sure that the IC and the DOD operate legally and constitutionally. We don't do a terribly good job. And so I don't quite know how we do that. I'm not sure most Americans want to sit down and talk to me for 5 minutes about FISA, but we do need to do a much better job. And one of the ways we do that, of course, and the report calls for it, is that the leadership of the IC and the DoD needs to spend a lot more time out there at conferences, building relationships inside academia, visiting companies. I'd love to have, it may have even happened, I'd love to have somebody like Sue Gordon go do a town hall meeting with the Google employees who had, issues with Project Maven or whatever. Look, we're relationship driven creatures, and the more those relationships are out there, the less the suspicion is going to impede our ability to partner with the private sector.
That's a great note to end on. Thank you very much, Congressman Himes, Corin Stone, Mike Brown. This was an absolutely great discussion. On behalf of Carrie Cordero and me, thank you very much to our audience for tuning in. Thank you for your fantastic questions. And I also want to tip my hat to my colleagues who work so hard behind the scenes to make these events run so smoothly. So big thank you to Jasmine Butler, Cole Stevens, Chris Estep, and DJ Shai Corman. Be well, and we'll see you next time. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thanks very much.